everybody. Welcome back to Office Hours Politics Edition, the show where we don't just follow headlines, we ask what's beneath them, the systems, the ideologies, the power plays. You guys asked and I answered. Today's episode is called The Empire is Cracking. The title wasn't just chosen for the shock value, although I do love shock value. It's a diagnosis, because what we're seeing, from the collapse of American legitimacy in the Middle East, to the economic turf war with China, to Canada's diplomatic identity crisis, this is not random. It's structural, it's imperial, and it is very much so unstable. We are going to break this all down today, not just to complain, but to understand, because if you felt like something was wrong and the pieces aren't adding up, or the old world is coming undone, you're right. And in this episode, we're going to talk all about it. I broke it up into 7 different segments because there's just a lot of current events going on, and we're talking about America, and I just go crazy when I speak about America. So to provide some context and structure to this episode, I thought I'd share. So our segment number 1 is the US tariffs on China. Let's begin our breakdown with the most material battlefield of global power, the economy. More specifically, the escalating trade war between the United States and China. A conflict that exposes more than just economic tensions. It reveals a fundamental crisis in American hegemony. In 2025, the US imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese imports. Over 66% of goods were targeted, with tariff rates climbing as high as 145% on certain high-tech products, semiconductors, and rare earth materials. These numbers eventually dropped, but only under intense pressure from global market, international partners, and domestic inflation concerns. But even now, the average tariff remains about 51%, sustained by political optics rather than economic rationale. China's response was strategic and measured. It retaliated with targeted tariffs on key U.S. exports, especially in sectors central to America's political base: agriculture, industrial tools, consumer electronics. The goal wasn't just economic pain, it was political pressure. Chinese policymakers knew exactly where to strike to rile the Americans up. So what does this mean for everyday life? Because I feel like we hear a lot of tariffs, and everyone's like, well, we're going to boycott American goods now. For manufacturers, it means increased product costs. Entire supply chains built on global interdependence were disrupted. Companies reliant on Chinese parts, operating costs rose a lot, to say the least. Many moved operations to other low-cost countries, but these shifts were expensive, slow, and far from seamless. For consumers, it means inflation. A Harvard study in the late of last year showed that tariffs contributed to a 2 to 3% increase in prices for everyday goods, a significant burden in the wake of post-pandemic inflation. Essential items like phones, laptops, appliances, and even toys saw sharp price hikes, and this, of course, disproportionately impacted low-income households. For workers, it means uncertainty. Some factories closed, others were able to outsource. Farms lost key export markets and saw their products rot in storage. And small businesses, the so-called backbone of the American economy, were left to adapt or to eat the cost. The supposed protection of American jobs quickly morphed into layoffs and bankruptcy. But let's be clear, this isn't a sound economic strategy, it's a hegemonic panic. International relations scholar Susan Strange once warned that when states lose control over the structures of power, production, finance, security, and knowledge, they lash out to reassert dominance. Tariffs in this context is not just about trade. They're instruments of control wielded by an empire sensing that its grip on global capitalism is slipping. From a political economic perspective, we can also bring in Robert Koch's distinction between problem-solving theory and critical theory. A problem-solving approach would frame tariffs as policy adjustments within a stable global order. But a critical theory lens, which is what we use here, asks whose interest does this global order serve? And what does it mean when a hegemon can no longer enforce its will without destabilizing the entire system? The answer is what we're witnessing: hegemonic decline. The US, long the architect of the free market, is now undermining the very rules it created. This is what scholars have warned about in the past. When the hegemon starts breaking the rules of its own liberal order, it signals not strength, but weakness. And the political context is just as revealing. Protectionist rhetoric has become the new norm in America. But this isn't about protecting workers. It's about channeling discontent. It's about redirecting anger from corporate deregulation, wage stagnation, and elite enrichment towards a foreign scapegoat. And this tactic isn't new. Historically, empires in decline often turn to economic nationalism as a way of preserving their domestic legitimacy. We saw this with Britain in the interwar years. We saw it with France during decolonization, and we're seeing it now with the US. An empire unable to reckon with its contradictions, seeking to externalize its crisis onto the global stage. But there's also an important ideological component here. For decades, the US has championed neoliberal globalization, advocating free trade, open markets, and deregulation. But what happens when the empire no longer benefits from the very system that it built? It turns inwards. It builds walls, both economic and physical. It attempts to reverse the tide of globalization, even as capital and climate crisis demand global cooperation. This moment, then, isn't about tariffs, it's about transition. A transition away from the unipolar moment that followed the Cold War towards a new contested global order where multipolarity, regionalism, and non-Western leadership are gaining ground. Let's not forget about the symbolic dimension. For China, every tariff is a test of its capacity to absorb pressure, its ability to lead an alternate vision of global development. For the US, every tariff is a confession that its economic dominance is no longer secure, and that fear has replaced confidence in its policymaking. In short, it's not just a trade war, it's a clash of world orders. It is the economic front line of a broader, deeper imperialist shift, and it reveals more about the future of power than any military nonsense could ever. To go into China, another empire, a different flavor. If the US is a hegemon in decline, then what or who is rising to take its place? The answer, most often named, is China. But to understand this moment of transition, we need to get beyond the surface level idea of US versus China. This isn't just a great power rivalry, it's not a reboot of the Cold War. What we're witnessing is a clash between different models of global power, different blueprints of empire, different ways of organizing the world system. But here's the twist. China isn't trying to become America. It's trying to offer something fundamentally different. Not necessarily better and not more democratic, but less hypocritical. That difference matters because in an age of deep global cynicism about the so-called rule-based order, even the appearance of an alternate is so powerful. Let's start with what China's doing materially. The Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013 and is the centerpiece of China's global strategy. It's not just an infrastructure project, it's a reimagining of global connectivity, rooted in China's ambition to become the primary architect of the 21st century development. Through highways, railways, ports, and digital infrastructure, China is physically redrawing the map of global trade and influence. As of this year, over 150 countries have signed to this agreement. Chinese state-owned banks have financed over $1 trillion in development loans, which is a very strategic investment. The financing is often being criticized as politically motivated, but for so many states in the global south, the question isn't, is China benevolent? The question is, who else is offering? And the answer increasingly is no one. Western institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, long seen as gatekeepers of development, have lost credibility. Their loans come with neoliberal strings attached, privatization, deregulation. China, by contrast, offers money with fewer political lectures. It doesn't demand democratic reform. It doesn't impose market fundamentalism. That approach appeals to regimes wary of Western conditionality and populations tired of being told that democracy and open markets will solve poverty. So the global system is no longer centered around a single liberal hegemon. Instead, we're entering a fragmented, contested landscape of overlapping regional powers, hybrid regimes, and competing norms. And China is at the center of that shift. But make no mistake, China's model is still imperial. It's a top-down system. It benefits elites, not always populations. It extracts raw materials from Africa, dominates markets in Southeast Asia, and buys political silence through investment. It offers stability, not justice, efficiency, not freedom. But, and this is key, it doesn't pretend to be morally superior. And this is what sets it apart from the US, their empire. As Edward Said warned in Orientalism, Western power often masks itself as the arbitrator of the world, presenting colonial domination as civilizing missions or military interventions as spreading democracy. China doesn't play that game. Its pitch is brutally pragmatic. We'll build your roads, not write your constitution. And for many countries burned by the centuries of Western hypocrisy, colonialism, structural adjustment, military development, that pitch is compelling. And it's shifting global alliances. In Africa, China is now the largest trading partner. In Latin America, it's funding infrastructure and digital networks. In the Middle East, it's buying oil. Even in Europe, economic dependencies are growing despite rising geopolitical suspicion. But here's the paradox. While the US loses legitimacy through overreach, China gains legitimacy through restraint. This means China's being more careful. And in international politics, carefulness can look like wisdom, especially when the alternative is endless wars, surveillance, and a whole bunch of crazy madness going on. And there's a deeper theoretical layer here. of cultural hegemony that tells us dominant powers don't just control militarily or economically, they shape the way people think about what's normal, desirable, inevitable. And for decades, the US did this through Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Ivy League economics. But the soft power is eroding. Now we're seeing a contrast, not just over resources, but over meaning. What does development look like? What does order look like? Who gets to define progress? In that context, China doesn't need to defeat the US militarily. It needs to offer something that feels more predictable, more useful, less moralizing. And at the same time, we must be clear-eyed. China's internal repression reminds us that its model is authoritarian. Surveillance, censorship, mass detention, these are tools of control. The challenge is when a declining liberal empire faces off against a rising illiberal one, the space for genuine democracy shrinks. This is the dilemma of the 21st century, a world stuck between collapsing liberalism and expanding authoritarianism, with little room for liberation in between. So when we say China is rising, we're not celebrating, I particularly, we're observing. We're tracking an alternate empire, one built on steel, debt, and data, rather than bombs and democracy and slogans. One that reflects values of order, sovereignty, and growth. But the takeaway isn't that China is the future we want. It's that US is no longer the future we can sustain. And the cracks between their power lies our responsibility. To imagine, to fight for models that center people, not profit, solidarity, not surveillance, justice, not just growth. The real global contest is just getting started. Moving towards the US and global isolation. To understand how empires unravel, we need to understand what happens when their moral authority collapses. Because it's not just about economic power or military presence, it's about legitimacy. And when legitimacy erodes, even the most powerful nations find themselves alone. We're also going to talk about legitimacy on another. But anyways, this brings us to the US and Israel. In December 2023, the UN General Assembly held a vote calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The world responded. 153 countries voted yes, only 10 opposed. Among the 10, you guessed it, the US. In 2024, the UN Security Council often gridlocked, passed Resolution 2728 demanding an immediate ceasefire. 14 members voted yes, the US abstained. Now on paper, they're just votes, but in reality, they are moral indictments. Moments when the world looked at one of the most powerful countries on earth and saw complacency in atrocity. Moments when US leadership looked like less guidance and more isolation. And this wasn't new. The US has long protected Israel at international level, vetoing dozens of Security Council resolutions, shielding it from accountability in international law, and continuing to fund its military to nearly $4 billion per year. But America has a homeless crisis. Who cares about Americans when we can give all of our money to Israel, right? But 2023, 2024 were different. They were marked not just by bombs, but by broadcasts. Daily footage of deceased children, filled hospitals, and mass graves, all streamed in real time to billions across the globe. And the US, it stood with the aggressor unconditionally. To understand why, we need to move past the cliche of what they like to throw out of shared values, special relationship. This isn't about history or democracy, it's about strategy. It's about empire. In geopolitical terms, Israel functions as a forward operating base for American interests in the Middle East. It's what critical theorist Dave Harvey defines as a territory through which imperial powers project force and secure resource flows. In the same way the British used India or France used Algeria, the US uses Israel, not to govern directly, but to maintain influence indirectly. By supporting Israel, the US guarantees a military ally in a region that holds 2/3 of the world's known oil reserves, sits at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, and has long been politically unstable. Relationship isn't moral, it's instrumental. And there are many theorists that have long argued morality in US foreign policy has always been subordinate to strategic utility. But here's the cost: global legitimacy. In Latin America, public protests against Israel's actions were not only widespread, they were often explicitly anti-American. In South Africa, the government took Israel to the International Court of Justice using the very legal frameworks the U.S. helped build post-World War II. In Europe, longtime U.S. allies like Ireland and Spain issued strong rebukes. Even within the U.S., a historic wave of student protests swept college campuses, invoking not just Palestinian solidarity, but a broader critique of American imperialism. The result? The US, for decades, this so-called leader of the free world, now looks increasingly like a rogue state in the eyes of the global South. This can be called normative isolation. When a soft power rests on the idea that legitimacy, not just coercion, makes a country influential. But the Gaza votes show that the U.S. soft power is in free fall. The same country that once exported dreams through Hollywood and human rights rhetoric is now exporting cluster bombs and vetoes. And Israel, it knows this, and it has been preparing for a post-U.S. world. Like many powers tethered to declining hegemony, Israel is hedging its bets. The U.S. faces a bigger problem: its own mythology. The American self-image is built on exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. is not just powerful but good, and it doesn't just lead the world, but it uplifts it. And that its wars are for peace, its interventions are for democracy, its alliances are for stability, but that myth cannot survive the images from Gaza. Not when schools are bombed with American-made weapons, not when water is cut off to 2 million people, not when entire families are erased in the name of security. And they're standing by that. This is when we enter the territory of ideological disintegration. When an ideology is no longer making sense to the people subjected to it, crisis emerges. What once seemed natural seems absurd. And that's the moment that we're in right now. Because if the US is supposed to be the moral compass of the world, then the needle is broken. When the compass no longer points true, people stop following it. And that's the danger of this moment, not just for US foreign policy, but for the global system it helped build. The rule-based order, the liberal internationalism, the post-World War II institutions, all lies on the belief that the hegemon follows the rules it makes. Gaza shattered that belief. And in its place, we see the rise of non-alignment, countries that refuse to choose between superpowers, that resist moral binaries, that challenge both Western hypocrisy and Chinese ambition. In that space, there's potential, but there's also risk, because when empires lose legitimacy, they scramble to maintain control. They often turn desperate, they double down, they lash out, they look inward, and they choose war over withdrawal, denial over reflection. And the victims always are people caught in the margins. Palestinians, migrants, refugees, protesters. So when we say the US is isolating itself, we don't mean it's withdrawing from the world. We mean it's detaching from the global moral consensus. It's becoming the empire that insists it's innocent even as the world stops listening. The irony is it's trying to preserve its global influence. The US may have accelerated its decline because isolation is not a sign of strength. It's the beginning of collapse. Turning towards Canada and the US. On the surface, Canada markets itself as everything the US isn't. Peaceful, multicultural, progressive, globally conscious, diplomatically principled. It performs the role of the liberal darling on the international stage. A polite peacekeeper in the world of loud militants, if you will. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Canada is not an innocent bystander. It's the empire's story. It's the junior partner. A middle power that maintains its relevance and secures its privileges by tethering itself to American hegemony. This isn't new. Canada's entanglement with this empire goes back to its very founding. In fact, Canadian Federation wasn't born out of a unifying national spirit. It was partly, because there were many reasons for Confederation, but partly born out of strategic fear. The post-Civil War America was aggressive. They were expansionist. They were ideologically driven. They had this idea that whatever they saw, it was literally theirs. Manifest destiny. The US was divinely ordained to dominate everything. Canadian elites knew that without unification and stronger ties to Britain, they'd risk being absorbed into the US. This whole 51st state, it ain't new. So from the very beginning, Canada's sovereignty was about defense, conditional, strategic. It wasn't about independence from the empire. It was about survival within it. Fast forward today, patterns hold. Canada's economy, military, foreign policy, and even cultural industries are deeply intertwined and in many cases subordinated to US power. Let's start with the economy. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports go to the US. That kind of dependency is extremely dangerous, not just financially, but politically. It gives Washington enormous leverage over Ottawa, especially in trade negotiations. And we've seen this with the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, the NAFTA reboot, where Canada was forced to accept terms that favored US agricultural dominance, tech monopolies, and intellectual property regimes. And the trade friction isn't going away. Canada and the US clashed over dairy quotas, lumber tariffs, digital service taxes, and even electric vehicle subsidies. Each time Canada tries to assert itself, each time it backs down. But why? Because Canada simply does not have the leverage. It doesn't have the economy, it doesn't have the military to push back. And more importantly, it doesn't have the political will. Canadian leadership across party lines have accepted that its path to global relevance is through Washington, not in spite of it. I mean, maybe we'll see a change with Mr. Mark Carney, but that's just how the past is played. This is what some political scientists call peripheral alignment. Peripheral alignment. When a smaller state strategically aligns with a hegemon to gain protection, access, and status. But that alignment comes at a cost: sovereign flexibility. We see this clearly in foreign policy. Tariffs, for example. In the past 2 years, the world rallied for a ceasefire. Canada waffled. While European countries like Spain and Ireland condemned Israel's actions in strong terms, Canada offered a vague statement about both sides and refused to back UN resolutions condemning violence. Yeah. Why? Because criticizing Israel, an extension of the US in the Middle East, risks angering Washington. And angering Washington risks everything from trade retaliation to intelligence upholding to diplomatic freeze out. I mean, we've kind of seen this change a little bit with Mark Carney threatening sanctions and such with France and Britain, I believe. But I'm kind of talking about like pre-Mark Carney, but I'm gonna weave him in here a little bit. So Canada, we play both sides. It echoes U.S. talking points while pretending to stand for international law. It performs solidarity while practicing complacency. This is what we can call, we can describe as the paradox of middle powers. They often position themselves as defenders of multilateralism and norms, but in practice, they depend on the very empires they claim to moderate. That contradiction played out at the past year's Canada-EU summit. Canadian officials arrived hoping to showcase climate leadership, trade cooperation, and shared values. Instead, they were met with frustration over trade imbalances, Canada's duplicity. But here's the truth. Europe sees through the act. It knows Canada isn't neutral. It knows that behind the friendly branding of a government trying to triangulate between collapsing and global poles, the US empire it needs, the European order it admires. And yet Canada still wants to be seen as a bridge builder, a peacekeeper, a humanitarian state. Let's interrogate that myth. Canada is very much so built on settler colonialism, a system that Canada just really never had the time to dismantle. We're living on Indigenous land. Indigenous people in a first world country, they don't have access to clean water. So we're not that great. I think that, to me, I don't know, it kind of mirrors the logic of the US empire, if you ask me. So when we talk about Canada-US relations, we're not just talking about diplomacy or trade, we're talking about an unequal entanglement between two imperial projects. One global, one domestic, one declining, one trying to be friends with others. Both sustained through the same structures of racial capitalism, resource extraction, political performance. And in that context, Canada isn't an independent actor, it's a junior manager of an empire, a state that survives by aligning with powers, even when that power is destructive. This is the deeper crisis of Canadian identity. As the US loosens legitimacy on the world stage, Canada has a choice. We can either double down on dependency, or like I said, we can go try and make friends. But making friends, forging a different path, would require more than rhetorical distance. It would require material. It would require us to utilize trade and foreign policy, military spending. And right now, I don't know. I don't think that we're fully aligned as a country as to how to maneuver. I don't know. I can't speak for Mr. Mark Carney. We're going to see what happens. I believe in him. But right now, we're walking a very tight rope, pretending to be neutral, preaching human rights while still very much so upholding the empire and avoiding hard truths. But in a world of collapsing order, this performance will not hold. Moving on to domestic control and a manufactured crisis. When empires lose power abroad, they don't quietly retreat, they turn inward. As global influence erodes, domestic control tightens. Borders harden, surveillance expands. Dissident is punished. The state becomes obsessed with order and security. And It becomes the language through which obedience is demanded. In the United States, the logic is unfolding in real time. One of the clearest examples is the escalation of immigration enforcement, especially through ICE raids. Across the country, raids are intensifying in scale, coordination, and brutality. Undocumented migrants, particularly from Latin America, are targeted, arrested, and deported in growing numbers. But let's be clear, this is not about the rule of law. It's about managing the crisis through scapegoating. It's about converting economic instability and political instability into racialized fear and using that fear to consolidate state control. Let's trace the roots. To understand the migration crisis, we need to understand imperial cause and effect. The US is not merely responding to undocumented migration, it's responding to conditions it helped create, now criminalizing those fleeing the wreckage, which I think is hypocrisy in its truest form. Start with the war on drugs. A decade-long campaign waged in both hemispheres in the 1990s and 2000s. The US funneled billions into militarizing Mexico's police and army under the guise of fighting narcotics. But instead of reducing violence, it deepened it. Corruption spread, cartels grew stronger, and civilians, of course, they paid the price. All while America's demand for drugs and America's export of guns kept fueling this chaos. Then came NAFTA. In theory, it promised prosperity through regional integration, but in practice, it devastated rural Mexico. Flooded with cheap, subsidized American corn, millions of Mexican farmers were driven off their land, unable to compete with industrial business that the US offered. They lost their livelihoods, and many had one option left: migrate north. Bringing up David Harvey again, this is what he calls accumulation by dispossession. A process where economic liberalization forcibly displaces people, allowing capital to consolidate control. The state criminalizes the very people it helped displace. ICE raids, then, are not about fixing the problem. They're about punishing the consequences of empire. They are about enforcing racial boundaries and class hierarchies, defining who gets to belong and who gets to be disposed. While migrants are targeted, the surveillance state expands. We see it in police militarization. Since 9/11, surplus equipment have been transferred to local police departments. SWAT teams now have armored vehicles. Drones fly over protests. Tear gas is used liberally. This is not about protecting communities. It's about controlling them. We see it in the criminalization of protests, from Standing Rock to Black Lives Matter to campus encampments. Activists are monitored, infiltrated, arrested. Laws are passed to label dissident as domestic extremism. Book bans sweep across school boards. History is rewritten. Education is sanitized. This is the transition from sovereign power to disciplinary power. When a state no longer rules just by force, but by surveillance, normalization, and internalized control. At the same time, the US's judicial system becomes less about justice and more about obedience. The Supreme Court, now stacked with reactionary judges, roll back rights with alarming consistency: abortion, affirmative action, environmental protections, indigenous sovereignty. Meanwhile, corporate immunity grows. Prosecutors target whistleblowers more than war criminals. Courts become tools not for liberation, but for legitimizing domination. And what ties it all together is fear. Fear is the glue. As theorist Wendy Brown explains in State of in states of injury, neoliberalism doesn't just deregulate markets, it remakes citizens as insecure subjects, constantly threatened by others, immigrants, protesters, Muslims, poor people. The fear is then harnessed to justify security budgets, detention centers, bordered walls, surveillance tech. It becomes a cycle. Imperialized violence abroad creates instability. Instability creates migration. Migration is racialized. Racialization justifies domestic control. Domestic control sustains empire. That was good. Wow. Did I blow your mind? This isn't just happening at the border, it's happening in prisons. Which now cage over 2 million people, of course, disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and poor people. It's happening in eviction courts where millions face homelessness while hedge funds buy up housing. It's happening in healthcare where survival depends on employment and insurance. These aren't isolated crises. They're part of a domestic counterinsurgency strategy. As the empire phrase, the goal is not reform, but discipline. And this eternal discipline is deeply racialized. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes, the U.S. state is designed to manage surplus life, people rendered redundant by global capitalism, and then contained through cages, deportations, and surveillance. But this containment is not control, and the fear is not legitimacy. The more the state relies on coercion at home, the more it reveals its weakness abroad. What we are seeing then is not just a crackdown, it's a regarded action, that desperate attempt of an empire to police its internal contradictions as external dominance splits. This is the hallmark of late stage imperialism: war outside, repression inside. Exceptionalism collapses into nationalism. Democracy becomes performance, and laws become a weapon, not a shield. The question isn't whether the U.S. can continue to enforce its will. It's whether anyone will still believe its stories about freedom, justice, opportunity, because belief is the foundation of legitimacy. And right now, belief is bleeding out. So when we talk about ICE raids, we're not just talking about immigration. We're talking about the maintenance of empire through internal repression. We're talking about how states manage the collapse of consent by manufacturing crisis, deploying fear, and expanding control. But the cracks are forming, resistance grows. But they're not just demanding policy change, they're demanding new systems, new futures, beyond borders, beyond police, beyond this empire. And that's where hope lives, not in reforming the machinery of control, but in dismantling it altogether. Moving on to power, legitimacy, and collapse, I think that this is a very, very important puzzle piece. Let's zoom out beyond individual headlines and policies, because what we're witnessing right now, again, is not just trade disputes, a border crackdown. It's not just about diplomatic failure or political scandal. What we're witnessing, and what I've been trying to get at, is a slower, more dangerous transformation, which is the crisis of legitimacy in a global empire. Here's the thing. Power without legitimacy can't last. It's not a prediction that's a political law, one rooted in centuries of theory and history. Let's start with Max Weber, a German sociologist who laid the groundwork for understanding modern state power. Weber argued that there are three main sources of legitimate authority: traditional authority, based on custom, inherited status, think monarchies; charismatic authority, based on magnetic leadership of an individual, think revolutionaries, cult leaders; And then there's the legal rational authority based on rules, institutions, and the belief that laws are applied fairly. The modern liberal state, especially the US, relies primarily on the third form, legal rational authority. Its claim to power is not God said so or I'm the chosen one, but this is the rule of law. And that's what makes America's power distinct, not just its force, but its narrative. The legitimacy depends on being seen as fair, procedural. Its legitimacy depends on being seen as fair, rule-based. But here's the catch. Those rules are exposed as selectively applied, as tools of domination rather than protection. The entire structure starts to rot from within. Let's start with a few examples. I'm glad you guys asked. When the US invades Iraq under the banner of freedom and weapons of mass destruction, but later supports Saudi Arabia as it bombs Yemen into famine, what message does that send about the rule of law? When its police arrest black teenagers for petty theft, while corporate executives defraud millions and walk free, what kind of justice is that? We can see this concept of hegemony, not just domination through violence, but domination through consent. A ruling class maintains control not only through force, but by shaping the way people think. Through media, education, religion, culture, it convinces people that the system is natural, inevitable, and desirable. But hegemony is never permanent. It requires continuous reproduction. And when that reproduction fails, that's when people stop believing in the system. And when they see through the propaganda, where the gaps between ideology and reality become too wide, the crisis emerges. The signs are everywhere. The trust in institutions are collapsing. Media is fragmented. Conspiracy replaces consensus. People are no longer agree on basic facts, let alone shared values. Protest movements are exposing the deep rage simmering beneath the surface. And on the international stage, the US finds itself isolated. It's what we can call exhausted sovereignty. The state still exists, the empire still marches, but the moral infrastructure is crumbling. The citizen no longer identifies with the nation. The governed no longer trusts the governors. Legitimacy once assumed now has to be enforced. That's why we see more surveillance, more policing, more courts stacked with ideologies, more bans, more repression, because when legitimacy dies, the state retaliates on force. But force is brittle. It can't create belief. It can only demand submission. But that's the paradox of the empire in decline. It becomes more aggressive as it grows weaker. It becomes more paranoid, more fragile, more violent. It lashes out, not just at enemies abroad, but at home. It confuses critique with betrayal. It makes obedience for stability. It mistakes obedience for stability. You can see this with the language of politicians. We must restore order. We must protect our values. We must defend our borders. These are not just plans, they're panicked rituals, the desperate performances of a system that knows it's losing control. But what the state fears most is not violence, it's disbelief. Because violence can be contained, but once people stop believing, there's no going back. They rarely start believing again. Once the myth collapses, so does the power it's built on. We saw it with the fall of Rome. We saw it in the Soviet Union. We saw it in the French monarchy, the Ottoman Empire. Systems look eternal until suddenly they weren't. And today we're seeing that in the US, with the US empire. It has bases, bombs, banks, but it does not have believers, or at least not enough. So what does the collapse look like in the 21st century? Not just financial crisis or military defeat, but the void of legitimacy. A society where institutions exist but no one trusts them, where elections happen but no one feels represented, where laws are passed but justice never arrives. The world that's being born around us, a world where the facade of democracy remains, but the substance is hollow. And yet, in that collapse, there's also possibility. Because when belief in empire dies, space opens, space to reimagine. The question always follows, what do we do? Because the collapse in and of itself doesn't guarantee liberation. History teaches us that when empires fall, they don't always give way to just. Sometimes they give way to chaos, to reaction, to fascism in new clothes. So the end of the empire must be met with intentionality, not just critique, but construction. We begin here. We study power. And I don't just mean we take political science classes or we read old white men with fancy titles. I mean we ask who gets to decide, who gets to define reality, who benefits from things if they stay the same. That's the heart of political literary, not just naming the names of the institutions, but seeing the ideologies beneath them. Is the Supreme Court neutral? Or is it a mechanism of preserving class hierarchy? Is the economy fair? Or is it organized around the extraction of value from labor? Is the nation state a source of freedom? Or a broader machine that decides who lives and who drowns? These aren't just academic questions, they're survival questions. And they push us to adopt different frameworks for analysis, not just liberalism, which tells us to vote every few years and trust institutions, but feminist theory that reminds us that power lives in households and relationships, post-colonial theory, which teaches us that nation states itself is a colonial invention, Marxist theory, which reveals that the role of capital in organized society not around need but around profit. These frameworks help us see that crisis we're in isn't a glitch, it's the design, which brings us to the next step. We reject fear. Fear is how empires survive. It teaches us to be afraid of migrants, afraid of other races, afraid of other faiths. It tells us that safety comes from control, that order comes from obedience. It's very Thomas Hobbes. But fear is a trap. And the antidote is not blind optimism, but it's clarity. That means refusing the manufactured crisis, refusing to believe that a $1 billion police budget makes us safer than housing does, refusing to accept that militarism is the price of freedom, refusing to normalize the idea that the planet must be destroyed so the GDP can grow. Systems can change. History proves it. Apartheid ended. Monarchies fell. Women won the vote. Slavery was abolished. Not because the system suddenly had a change of heart, but because people fought and the systems fell. So that's what we're called to do now. Not to save the empire, not to make it kinder, smarter, or more diverse, but to build something better in its place. That's it for this episode of Office Hours Politics Edition. We started with tariffs, moved through Gaza, through ICE, through Canada, through collapse, but really we talked about power, how it hides, how it falls, how it adapts, and how, if we choose to pay attention, can interrupt it. If anything in this episode challenged you, sit with it. If it angered you, organize around it. And if it resonated, share it. Because the worst thing we could do right now is watch the empire fall and treat it like a Netflix episode. This is our lives. Until next week, I am Ziana. Stay awake, stay principled, stay politically curious. Bye, guys.